This happened to me several months ago during the summer. I had just graduated from high school, but I still didn't have my driver's license yet. I was just a teenage girl who was more focused on finishing my last year of high school than learning to drive anyway. My parents were out of town for the week, so I was supposed to be staying home to watch the house and pets. However, my friend and I had plans to have a sleepover and get smoothies the very day my parents left. I put on my favorite dress, gathered up my purse and my bus pass, and walked on over to the stop. I called my mom to tell her where I would be that night. She of course finished with, "Stay safe." With that, I hung up and made my way to the bus stop nearest to my house. After I boarded the bus, I sat in my seat quietly and texted my friend, very excited about the plans we had made together. The bus was crowded and sticky from the summer heat, but I was way too eager to care about anything like that. A few stops before the one I needed to get off at, a man entered the bus. The man was shaggy, messy, with whitish gray hair and lots of stubble on his chin as well. He was wearing blue hospital scrubs. He shuffled onto the bus, dragging one foot slightly. He then stopped and made direct eye contact with me. It felt like an eternity, locked in a dead gaze with this strange man. Eventually, he looked away and made his way to the seat directly behind me. I just knew he was going to do that the very second we locked eyes. He wasted no time at all putting his hands through the hole between the backrest and the metal bar that lined the head of my seat. His hands dangled behind my neck, and if I tried to lean back in my seat comfortably, I would have been right on them. I could feel his thick, heavy breath circling my neck and shoulders. At the very next stop, I flew out of my current seat and pretended to retrieve one of the bus route pamphlets directly behind the driver. I then sat down in the seat right behind them to escape this creepy man who was still watching me. I pretended to read over the pamphlet, trying not to seem as though I was trying to get away from him. But then, and I knew it was coming, the man moved closer to my new location at the next stop. I could feel his wide eyes boring into me. At this point though, I had had enough of this song and dance. It was not my stop to get off yet, but I couldn't take this intense stare any longer. This close proximity was agonizing to me. I pulled the yellow cord to signal I wanted to get off. It was only one stop ahead of the one I needed to get off at anyway, so I didn't think it was too inconvenient. I would have only had to walk one more intersection anyway. As the bus driver pulled to a stop, I launched out of my seat and off the bus as fast as I could. And there it was, the feeling I knew would return, the feeling he would just so happen to get off with me. And he did. I walked quickly in the direction of my destination, with a prayer in my head. I had my phone in my hands the entire time, texting my friend. I dialed in 911, and I was ready to hit that call. Suddenly, I heard it, the sound of shuffling and feet scraping against the asphalt. I knew it was coming from the one leg that man dragged as he walked. I turned around, only to see him now sprinting at me. He had his arms out toward me and was working extra hard to pick up his limp left leg to catch up to me. His breathing was even more labored and raspy. I ran as fast as I could down that busy street. I was surprised that nobody seemed to notice a young girl being chased by a middle-aged man in a hospital dress. I ran into a nearby shop that sold skateboards and the like. As I burst in, out of breath and panting, the young man working at the register turned to me and asked, "Hi, how are you? Are you okay?" I answered very weakly, "I'm fine, I think, but I'm being chased. Can I please hide here until I can call my friend to come get me?" The man looked shocked at my response. My hands were shaking very hard. He led me over to the back of the store and sat me down. I explained what happened, and he waited with me as I called my friend. Some time passed before she got to me. The man from the bus was nowhere to be found, and we went home together. We were both terrified, looking over our shoulders for the rest of the way home. I still regret not calling the police. I used to work at Pizza Hut when I was in high school. I have a lot of bizarre stories from working there, but this is the one that scared me most. My Pizza Hut was the kind where you could only pick up the food. There was also a wall between the storefront and the kitchen, so if you were in the front of the store, you were pretty much on your own. The store itself was also located in a kind of out-of-the-way dead shopping center. Oh, and it was in Las Vegas too. That should tell you a whole lot about the level of our clientele. For whatever reason, I always seemed to get stuck on the late shift despite being in high school still. So on most weeknights by 10 at night, it would be just me and one other cook in the store, twiddling our thumbs mostly. I would hang out at the front. The cook was usually way at the back of the store out of earshot. One night, I was hanging out behind the counter when I saw this guy walk past. I didn't really think too much of it at first and went back to doing nothing while waiting there for my shift to end. Then though, the door to the store opened. I looked up and realized it was that very same guy who had just walked by. He was tall but also skeletally thin, and there was something not quite right about his eyes. Despite him putting me on edge though, I got up and greeted him and asked him what he'd like to order. Nothing. He just stood there in front of me, staring up at the ceiling and muttering to himself. I was only 17 at the time, and for the most part a good kid despite living in Sin City, so I really didn't know what to make of this situation. Now, knowing more, I would probably chalk it up to being on drugs. Anyway, he was still standing there, vacant expression, and muttering in what sounded like tongues. As abruptly as he had come in, he just spun around and walked right back out the store, not even acknowledging that I existed. I was unnerved, of course, but I shook it off and sat back down. It was getting toward the end of my shift, and I was counting down the minutes when I realized somebody had walked back into the store. I look up. It's the exact same guy, same creepy eyes, only this time he's holding a phone up to his ear. He was muttering unintelligibly, and I realized he was not actually talking to anyone. Worse, he was staring right at me, super intense and unblinking. At this point, I was starting to get frightened. He would not stop staring at me. I tried to be polite once more and asked if I could help him with anything. He started to slowly walk toward the counter, still staring at me. Then, suddenly, he asked in a perfectly normal voice if his order was now ready. Mentally, I was thinking, what the fuck at this point? I was not really sure how to answer when he'd never actually ordered anything. So, I went with the truth. I very tentatively pointed out to him that he'd never actually ordered anything when he came in the first time. He got this bug-eyed look on his face and lunged toward the counter. I jumped back at this point, and my heart was pounding. This guy was obviously not in the right state of mind. I was afraid he was going to pull out a knife or something and stab me. Just as abruptly as he lunged toward me and tried to grab me, he yelled, "God damn it!" He looked super confused and upset, like he was about to cry. He put his head into his hands and started pulling out his hair. I started to feel slightly bad at this point. I asked as nicely and calmly as I could if maybe he wanted to order something now. His head immediately snapped back up. His expression was now completely blank, and he looked completely deranged. I was now holding still. I was afraid even moving would set him off. Thankfully though, the door to the store then opened, and a huge man walked in. He looked at this guy kind of confused, realizing something was not quite right with him. The crazy guy looked at him, then looked at me. Then he started backing up until he was out the door. He started walking toward the edge of the storefront, looking at me the entire time. Then he walked past the edge and was suddenly gone. The man who walked in looked at me and asked me what the hell that was. I looked at him and said I had no idea. I thought he was crazy. I tried to shake it off, but of course I was totally on edge for the rest of my shift. When I clocked out that night, I made one of the drivers walk out with me. Then I jumped in my car and got out of there as fast as possible. I never did see that dude again, but it was a really weird experience and very unnerving. I'm also not sure what he would have done if that other guy hadn't walked in when he did. I attend a college that's located in one of the poorest cities in Northern California. The campus is a relatively safe space, since the school employs its own Department of Public Safety. After the sun sets, though, it's usually a good call to remain indoors no matter what. That's when the townies come out and tend to wander onto campus. About 2 years ago, I was living in an apartment complex on the main part of campus, and I still didn't have a car yet. It was the end of the fall semester, and I was the last person in my apartment of 3 girls to finish taking finals. This meant I was home alone, since my roommates had already gone home for winter break. I got back from taking my very last exam and followed my usual routine of dejectedly collapsing into bed to cry and sleep off the effects of pulling an all-nighter. When I finally woke up, it was already past 10 p.m., and I was starving. Unfortunately, the student grocery store and cafeteria were closed for the day. I had nothing to eat in the apartment, and no car to get food elsewhere either. I was woefully poking around in the fridge in the hopes I would find something substantial to tide me over until the morning, when I noticed a Domino's coupon someone had stuck to the freezer. My stomach's pathetic cries for sustenance had finally been answered. I very quickly decided there was no shame in ordering a whole pizza plus Santa sticks for myself, because 1, I was ravenous, 2, the completion of finals demanded some sort of celebration, and 3, if anyone happened to ask, I was going to lie and say I was sharing with my friends. Anyway, I eagerly ordered up my feast for 1 and provided the cashier with my address, apartment, and cell number. I typically never give out my number to anyone, but I had ordered delivery from Domino's in the past, and I knew they needed my number to call me once they were outside. Those drivers always got lost navigating through campus. About 20 minutes later, I got the call. My food was here. For reference, it was now very close to midnight, and the campus was pretty much dead since most other students had gone home. The driver told me he was parked in front of a dorm building that was right across the street from my apartment. I hustled out and was going down the stairs when I spotted the delivery guy waiting outside his car with my pizza. At this point, my sense of caution kicked in. I slowed my pace, as my brain took in the fact there were no other students around. The lighting was extremely bad in that area, and I was essentially walking right up to a stranger in his car that still had its engine running. As I neared the bottom of the steps, I silently hoped he would cross the street and approach me so I wouldn't have to get near his car. Of course, that didn't happen. I made my way across the street and was finally able to get a good look at him. He was a relatively short Hispanic guy, maybe 5'7" to 5'9". He was in his early 20s, and my nerves were immediately getting bombarded by the creeper vibes he was giving off. I could only compare it to the vibe that you get when you're out clubbing and you suddenly spot the guy lurking in the crowd sporting the slicked back ponytail, sunglasses, oversized shirt, and sagged pants combo, who just so happens to be headed in your direction. I did my best to appear calm and keep the mood light and friendly. He made some comments about how late it was and how no one was around at all. I just signed the receipt as quickly as possible, gave him my thanks and an awkward smile, and hightailed it out of there. I could feel him watching my back as I climbed the stairs back to my place. Once I got back into my apartment, I locked and chained up the door and sat down on the living room couch to calm myself. After a few moments, I shrugged off the situation and reasoned that it was just my paranoia and overactive imagination acting up again. I had just turned on the TV and was about to take my first bite of pizza when I got a text from an unknown number. "You know, you're hella sexy." I connected the dots immediately. I matched the text number to the call I had received earlier from the pizza delivery guy. My initial reaction, of course, was shock, since nothing like that had ever happened to me before. That eventually melted away into laughter and disbelief, though, when I considered my appearance at the time. Like I had mentioned earlier, I had just woken up from my nap after taking the very last of my finals. I was wearing a raggedy pair of sweatpants, a loose sweatshirt, my hair was extremely nappy and tied in a messy ponytail, and my face was greasier than the pizza I was eating. To top it off, I had glasses on too. It was definitely not a pretty picture, much less anything that could come close to resembling hella sexy. The next morning, I got a call from my boyfriend John. I casually told him about this guy and the events that had transpired that previous morning. After sheepishly trying to defend my actions on the basis of poor judgment caused by extreme hunger and promising to never do that sort of thing again, John convinced me I should report it to campus police as a precautionary measure. I gave them a call and an officer stopped by my apartment a few hours later. I relayed my story. He took some pictures of the text message and wrote down the guy's phone number. The officer then told me he could contact the Domino's if I wanted him to, but it would most likely result in the guy's termination. I was still relatively unfazed by the whole situation. I told the officer I just wanted to make sure this creep never did this to any other girls on campus. At the same time though, I didn't really want him to lose his job. The officer then started asking me questions about how I felt after my encounter. Did I feel threatened? Do I feel safe in my apartment with the knowledge he had my phone number and exact address? Well, if I wasn't scared before, I definitely was now, and during the course of my questioning, I broke out in a cold sweat. My traitorous imagination began conjuring up all sort of dastardly situations that all ended in my untimely demise. In the end, I ended up giving the officer the go-ahead to pursue my case and contact the Domino's. About a month later, while I was at home celebrating the holidays, I got a call from my boyfriend. You see, I had left him the keys to my apartment so he could store his bike there and crash in my room while I was away. He told me he had stopped by my place, but he couldn't get in because the keys weren't working. He also said it looked like someone had broken in because there was glass on the floor and a wooden board across my window. I was pretty upset, of course. This was my first time hearing about any of this. I called the school the next day to figure out what the hell happened. Housing transferred my call to the public safety department. The officer I spoke to was only able to tell me that according to their records, a maintenance worker had called them 2 days after I headed home to report my broken window. Public safety had responded by boarding it up and changing the lock when they noticed it had been tampered with. I convinced the officer to let my boyfriend into my apartment so he could check if anything was stolen. Thankfully, nothing was. My gut tells me it was the delivery guy who did it. It was him who tried to pick my lock and then broke my window. It scares me even more now when I consider the fact that nothing had been stolen. My flat-screen TV was right by the window that had been broken, and my boyfriend's fancy road bike was sitting right there in the living room. Why didn't he steal anything? Does that mean his intentions were to break in and get his revenge on me? The girl that had cost him his job? Would this still have happened if I had not given the officer permission to pursue the case? I try not to spend too much time speculating about what his true intentions were, but when I do, it still makes my heart race when I think about what could have happened had I still been in my apartment at that time. This happened a few years back when I was 12 or 13 years old. I'm from the Philippines for reference. It was Sunday afternoon, probably 5 to 6 o'clock, and I was at home with my dad. My mom had left to buy some groceries about 30 minutes ago using her only car. As I was watching videos on YouTube, the doorbell suddenly rang. It rang quite a few times until I'd finally had enough of it. That's when I knew I had to check who was there. Knowing my dad was probably sleeping in the other room, I reluctantly went downstairs to open the door. The thing is, I've dreaded opening the front door for people ever since my grandpa scolded me for opening the door for the mailman in his house. He always lectured me about how dangerous it could be, like I could be snatched up and kidnapped or something. With that thought, I climbed on the sofa, which was 3 feet away from the front door, and pulled the curtains to see who was ringing the doorbell. Note that the window I looked through was surrounded by a tall fence 4 to 5 feet away, so I felt perfectly safe. I found it convenient later on once I talked to him. He had a dark cap on and a blue jumper. He looked pretty normal to me, but also we weren't expecting anyone on this quiet Sunday. I asked the man what his business was, and he replied that he was supposed to deliver a pizza to my address. Excited and a bit confused, thinking my dad had secretly ordered pizza for us, I told him to wait for me to get my dad. I climbed upstairs to my parents' room and saw my dad was sleeping. I woke him up and asked him if he'd ordered a pizza. He replied in a daze that he had not. Disappointed, I went back downstairs to break the news to the delivery guy, who'd probably gotten the wrong address. When I got back to the window, though, he was long gone. Since I was pretty young back then, I really didn't think much of it until now. Today, I'm pretty certain I was almost kidnapped, though. One, it was extremely quiet outside and my bedroom window was open. I didn't hear a motorcycle revving near the house, nor hear one when he left. Two, he just left like that even though I specifically told him to wait. I didn't even get to tell him that we hadn't ordered a pizza. Three, I didn't see a logo for the place he was working for either. The strange thing was that we only had two that were near us, and they both had a distinctive red color. My mom's theory is the guy probably thought I was home alone because our single car was gone, and my dad rarely got out of the house since he was unemployed back then. What probably got him to leave was when I told him to wait for me to get my dad. If not for my grandpa's scolding, I would have totally answered the door and probably not be here sharing this. So a few months ago, I was out hiking with my friend. We live in the mountains of western MD, and we were about 6 miles into an 8-mile loop we had done pretty frequently. At this point, we decided to take some pictures and eat a snack at the summit. This area of the trail had a park, benches, tables, and a parking lot. We were sitting and talking when I noticed a man just walking around in the parking lot alone. He was walking aimlessly and staring at his feet. What confused me though was that he was in jeans and a button-down shirt. Not exactly appropriate hiking attire. We decided to set off on the last 2-mile leg of that loop. This part goes downhill to the headquarters of the park and is cut out of the mountain/bank. The end of that leg is the parking lot where our car was. You don't have a lot of visibility from the trail, and you have to walk in a single file. I was walking in front and talking to my friend. I turned around to look at her, only to see the same man right behind her, following at an extremely close distance. Immediately, I got a gut-wrenching feeling. I noticed he didn't have any pack or hiking gear and was not even wearing boots. Something about his eyes really spooked me. A bit more walking, and he continued to get even closer. I said to my friend that I had to tie my shoe as a reason to step off the trail and give him an opportunity to pass us by. Perhaps he was only following closely because he wanted to go faster than we were. She immediately caught on to what I was doing, and we pulled over to the side. He looked very startled. She waved hello and said hi politely. The man just stared at us. That's when I noticed he was carrying a stick. As I'm fiddling with my shoe, she stood between us, and he passed us by. We waited to give him some distance ahead of us, but he immediately slowed down. We waited for even longer. He got to the furthest part of the trail that had sightlines to us, and he turned around, stopping to look at us. Immediately, we knew something was too wrong about this guy. We didn't want to have to pass him by again. We turned around and walked back up the trail toward the park, with the picnic tables and parking. After a few minutes of walking back up the trail, I looked back, only to see him now following us again. I told my friend to walk even faster. We booked it up the trail and got to the parking lot area we were at before. We started to strategize and wait, deciding we would wait to see if he came all the way back up the trail to the lot. Thankfully, there were people around here, so we felt safer waiting it out. About 20 minutes go by and nothing. We were talking about how that could mean he had kept going on the trail and was long gone, or perhaps waiting where it was more deserted. We see a couple come up from the trail where we were, presumably taking the loop in the opposite direction that we are. We approached them and asked if they'd seen anyone on the trail between this lot and the next. They told us they saw a young man sitting on a rock about halfway down. They described the exact man who was following us. We explained our interaction with him to the wife and got into a conversation back and forth about whether or not he was a threat. The husband finally interjected. "We need to call a ranger right now. He wasn't just sitting there. He had a knife and he was carving that stick." Needless to say, we called the ranger. The nice couple walked that last leg with us to make sure we got to our car safely. Then they even gave us their numbers, just in case we needed anything. The rangers walked the trail, but there was no sight of the man. I wish I knew where he'd gone and what happened to him, but I'm glad to know that my instincts are legitimate. I worked as a cocktail waitress when I was 22 years old. My shift was from 5 p.m. until 2 a.m. As a waitress, I'd become fairly used to being harassed. Usually, it wasn't anything too over the top or frightening though. Most customers were regulars who flirted innocently. Just good-natured banter, nothing threatening or in any way sinister at all. Up until this night, I'd never felt a sense of danger from any of the customers I'd waited on. On this particular night though, everything changed. I was being harassed by a creepy customer I'd never seen before. He'd said such inappropriate things to me that they really crept me out. He was relentless with them too. At one point, as I was serving his drink, he reached out and put his hand on my ass. After this happened, I never went back to his table again. If he wanted another drink, he'd have to go up to the bar and ask the bartender himself. I was through with waiting on this sinister creep. This happened back in 1978, so it was at a time when I didn't have any recourse when things like this happened. The bartender only made customers leave when they were far too drunk to sit on a bar stool or at a table or booth. Otherwise, we were left on our own to deal with these creepy customers. At closing, the man finally left. Even though he was gone though, I still felt such a sense of unease. I wasn't easily spooked, but this guy had really freaked me out for some reason. There was just something off about him. It took me nearly an hour after closing to complete the work and cleaning I had to do to have the bar ready for the following day. It was about 3 a.m. as I made my way through the dark parking lot to get back to my car. This was an extremely deserted and isolated place at night. The lot had woods that surrounded it entirely. That in and of itself was creepy. As I was about halfway to my car though, out of the very corner of my eye, I saw him. My heart began to pound as I realized he had waited in the lot for me the entire time to come out. I knew in that moment I had to get to the safety of my car, or this man was going to do God knows what to me. I was young and fit, thankfully, whereas this man was in his late 40s and overweight. My thoughts were quickly assessing my situation. I really didn't want to be kidnapped and murdered. This was the scenario I envisioned if this man got to me before I could get to my car. I knew I had to make a run for it, so I ran as fast as possible. I jumped inside the car and locked the door immediately. It wasn't one moment too soon either, because this man was now at my driver's side window, demanding I roll it down. He kept yelling he didn't want to hurt me. He only wanted to talk. He began to pound on my window as I fumbled with my keys to try and get the hell out of there. I began to fear he'd shatter my window entirely and get his hands on me. Finally, I got my car started. As I put my car into reverse and backed out, he began to scream bloody murder. He was yelling for me to stop, because apparently I'd run over his foot. My gut instinct, though, told me this man was faking the injury to get me out of my car. I was not going to get out for any reason. I drove home as fast as I could. Once home, I called the police. They came to take my report and get my description of the guy. At this point, I wasn't really certain about whether I had injured him or not. I explained all of this to the officer. The police sent another officer to the parking lot to see if he was still there and suffering from an injury. He wasn't there at all. Nobody called the police to report a hit and run either. The police told me I'd done the right thing by not falling for that ruse. I called my boss the following day and told him I would not be returning to work there. I'd never been so frightened by anyone before. It was a night in which I truly feared for my life. There was no way I could make myself return to that job. That night still haunts my dreams.